Well, thank you, John. I think, apart from Jim Molan, I'm the only politician here. Although occasionally, when I read my friend Peter Lay's contributions in The Australian, I wonder whether he's crossing the line. Anyway, I do appreciate the invitation to be with you today and to participate. I won't claim that mine is a scholarly contribution. It's rather some thoughts from experiences and hopefully sharing some of the lessons I think I've learned from a political perspective. As has been said, these wars have been huge endeavours for Australia, and they've touched so many Australians in different ways. And even though they continue today, I think it is worthwhile to pause and reflect on the experiences and lessons learned. To even try and understand why we are still engaged is important, because I can tell you that wasn't the intention. As we know, much of this conference is about the military experience, but the operations were as a result and continue to be as a result of political decisions of the government of the day. So I'm pleased that you are also interested in the processes which led to those decisions. Politicians should learn from past experiences in the same way as the military should learn. And I was one of those politicians at critical moments, and as I said, I'm happy to share some personal reflections. I came to defence from the environment portfolio. I was given that job because it had always been a conflict zone for my side of politics. I won a few of those battles and settled a few through peaceful means, and as a result was looking forward to a job which would be a little more settled. Anyway, it was a privilege to be Australia's Defence Minister, and I'll be forever grateful for the men and women of the services and their families, and of the officials of the department who carried out the mission set by government with professionalism and determination. I was also lucky to have a military and departmental leadership of the highest calibre. There were some difficult times and they shone through. And at the same time, Rick Smith almost managed to balance the books. The defence leadership sometimes finds the political world a bit bewildering. A bit untidy might be another word. There's no minimum qualification to be a politician, no one course of study. Experience is not required. A defence minister could come from any background. You have to go back a long way to find a defence minister of this country with military service. Occasionally there's someone in cabinet with a military background, but again, it's rare. It's even unusual to find someone with a background in strategic policy. So how does such a group of apparently unqualified individuals make a decision to take a country to war? Or more particularly in this context, to deploy Australian forces in both Afghanistan and Iraq? And of course, the latter decision is still the subject of critical debate in some circles. It's easy to say, well, of course, the politicians make an assessment of the national interests. But how do they determine what is in the national interest? Each politician is, of course, influenced by their individual values and experience. In my case, I was trained in the law. I believed in a rules-based order, both domestically and internationally. In the early 90s, I was working to build democracies in the post-Cold War era because I believed in the basic freedoms that underpin democracy. Before that, I used to focus through Amnesty International on getting political prisoners out of jails in Cuba and elsewhere because I believed in universal human rights. And I'm also a globalist. I believe in the interdependency of nation states. I also believe in alliances based on shared values. And I've always feared the indiscriminate and destructive power of weapons of mass destruction. I started working for non-proliferation almost 40 years ago. So to this background, I had to assess my position on our military participation in these wars. First to Afghanistan. The enormity, the cruelty and barbarism, and the interterritorial nature of the 9/11 attack on the US had a major influence on me. I can't stand on the site today without shaking my head in disbelief. How could this happen? What is the world coming to? It led John Howard to immediately invoke the ANZUS alliance, although in technical terms that was a decision for the Cabinet, which we made a few days later on his return to Australia. We saw it as an attack on our ally, the United States, but also and fundamentally an attack on our shared values. I remember the day after the attack, I was on an island off the coast of the Northern Territory working in my previous portfolio, and we had a telephone hookup of the leadership group. We took advice from our security agencies and we made decisions to ensure Australia's immediate security from this threat. We didn't fully understand the threat or what was going on, but we feared it would also envelop Australia. And sadly, we were proven right some time later when those who shared the same ideology as Al-Qaeda deliberately targeted Australians. ANZUS might be primarily a commitment to consult, but it wasn't surprising that a short time later we took the decision to commit forces to Afghanistan in support of the United States. And the Afghanistan response had Security Council support and was not particularly controversial. Attacking Al-Qaeda included removing the Taliban, which had provided the international terrorists with bases and support. It's interesting that if the Taliban had not supported Al-Qaeda and thus added the international aspect, it might have been able to continue its abuse of its own Afghan people for some time. Removing the Taliban did run the risk of creating a vacuum in governance, but it was a responsibility the UN was prepared to take up. Australian troops were deployed after I became Defence Minister, but pursuant to a decision made prior to my appointment. I remember visiting Kabul shortly after I became Defence Minister and meeting the UN Secretary-General's Special Representative Brahimi. It was in part to brief him on the Australian deployment and in part to explore how Australia might help in the post-war reconstruction and transition in governance. It was all reasonably orthodox stuff. I guess the first mildly controversial decision I was involved in relation to Afghanistan was the government's decision to withdraw our special forces. It was said that this was in preparation for pending operations in Iraq. But in truth, both myself and the government were concerned to avoid mission creep. The task for which these special forces had been sent, we believe, had been achieved. The benefit of hindsight, we don't think it was quite as straightforward as that, but it was our belief at the time. In sequence, the Iraqi intervention was the next seminal event and more politically contentious, but to simplify the narrative, I will stay with Afghanistan for the moment. The next big decision of government was to return to Afghanistan with both special forces and a provisional reconstruction team. I'd been a strong advocate of the need for the international community to support the development of sustainable institutions and basic necessities, health, education, infrastructure in Afghanistan. It's not only a good thing to do, but it helps guard against the return of another extremist regime. The trouble was that Afghanistan was never really post-conflict. The overlap between the role of the military in providing security and civilians in providing aid is not easy. But to me, development was essential if Afghanistan was going to stand a chance of normalcy. I took to the NSC, the National Security Committee of Cabinet, a bid for a provincial reconstruction team and came out with a PRT and a government decision to return the Special Forces to Afghanistan. It was an interesting day at the office. I nevertheless supported the return of Special Forces as there clearly was a continuing need for that capability. It was more a question of what we could reasonably do with the resources available, and I was always concerned about overreach. The role of the military in nation building is not straightforward. Some still don't see it as proper defence business. But during my subsequent years at the United Nations as Australia's ambassador, I was pleased to see military attitudes changing. The challenge is to get the right mix. I don't think the international community invested enough in nation building in Afghanistan, but it still might not have worked. Afghanistan will be a work in progress for a long time, and I'll return to it in my conclusions. But to Iraq, despite what some might say, this intervention did not commence as an operation against terrorism. Certainly for our part, it also was not an operation to secure oil. For Australia, it was a response to the perceived threat posed by Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction program. He had had weapons of mass destruction, even used them against his own people at little international cost. What had recently changed was the risk threshold that the United States was prepared to accept. And as with Afghanistan, this related back to 9/11. President Clinton knew Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan posed a threat, but his limited response had not removed that threat. President Bush knew Saddam Hussein was a threat. He had previously invaded his neighbours and drawn the US, Australia and others into that conflict. The inability of the UN processes to satisfy the UN administration that Saddam Hussein had really forgone his weapons of mass destruction, i.e. complied with the various UN Security Council resolutions, left a risk too great to accept. And of course, history showed that conflict in that region, from Saddam Hussein's unquenched expansionism goals, would in all likelihood again draw us in. But this time it might subject Australian forces to chemical and biological weapons. This was a risk too great for us to bear. So the national interest was to support our ally in the heavy lifting and secure against what might become a direct threat to Australia and Australian interests. So at the time of the intervention, did Saddam Hussein possess weapons of mass destruction? I had watched the UN processes intently. There was always an ambiguity in Saddam's response. He always seemed to be hedging. There were a lot of wise men after the event, but my intelligent briefings at the time were that he did maintain these capabilities, biological and chemical, not nuclear. In fact, I was briefed on what was believed to be his command and control regime. Who would give the command, etc., for the use of these weapons? I'll never forget those briefings. Defence insisted that I be inoculated against anthrax before travelling to Iraq, which is something I would not have accepted if there was any doubt. But nevertheless, I wanted to hear different perspectives. So I travelled to the US and I listened to the intelligence services, their intelligence services on the subject. The brief was similar, although they were even more confident of some aspects. I then went to the UK, a similar brief, and they added that their views were shared by the intelligence services of France, Israel and Russia. So don't tell me that this was an invention of the politicians. It's easy to be wise after the event, but in making these decisions, we don't have the benefit of hindsight. It would seem the intelligence services around the world got it wrong. I don't blame them, it's not a precise science. It's a judgment made on the best available information. I accept the intelligence services, particularly Australia's, were acting professionally and in good faith. Clearly they were influenced by Saddam's previous behaviour, which is not unreasonable. The complication here was that Saddam Hussein ruled through fear, and weapons of mass destruction and his willingness to use those weapons was a tool he used internally and an inferred threat in relation to his neighbours. It would seem that he had complied with the Security Council resolutions, but had a vested interest in terms of his authority to maintain an ambiguity. His belief was that the ambiguity would not lead to an intervention. It was a bluff he lost because he failed to appreciate how the risk appetite of the US had changed after 9/11. The same mistake the Taliban made in relation to Afghanistan. I also wanted to briefly address the allegation that we had committed to war before the Cabinet decision that immediately preceded the public announcement. There is a distinction between preparing for the decision that Cabinet might make and the making of such a decision. Certainly, I had been party to decisions over some time to support the ADF being best prepared in the event that Cabinet made a decision to commit Australian forces. It always struck me as the sensible thing to do, and I said so publicly on a number of occasions. Even without my endorsement, I would expect the ADF to be planning for various scenarios. It's what militaries do. But decisions such as entering the US planning processes does require a political imprimatur. I concede it's a difficult area. If it comes to pass that we choose to be part of a US-led military operation, the more we understand about the operation, obviously, the better off we are. The worry is that by undertaking such preparations, the ally assumes a commitment that the Government of Australia had not made. It's even trickier if, dare I say, we contribute in some ways to the development of the plans. I also wanted to touch on the legal basis of the government's decision, because it is important to appreciate that this was a government that does believe in an international rules-based order and will only make a decision such as this that is believed to be legally sound. In other words, To say that it's the right thing to do is insufficient. The government took legal advice in this matter, and subsequently the Prime Minister tabled publicly that advice, that on the basis of the previous resolutions of the Security Council, there was a sound international legal justification for the action. We relied more on the Security Council resolutions, whereas the US also relied quite heavily on the so-called notion of preemptive self-defence. Speaking personally, I was somewhat taken by the concept of preemptive self-defence, because I think when one is dealing with weapons of mass destruction and asymmetric warfare, the traditional notion of what amounts to self-defence is hardly relevant today. But we erred on the side of caution and relied on the Security Council resolutions, and I guess that reflects that we were a somewhat cautious government. The next area I wanted to touch on is the day after issue. If it was agreed that there was an unacceptable threat that required the removal of Saddam Hussein and his regime, what was to happen the day after? This was a coalition of the willing. There was not going to be a UN Security Council administration. I had asked for briefs on the issue relating to the responsibility of an occupying power, and I'd particularly asked for briefs on what was the plan. I must say that we Australia, at pains to argue that we were not an occupying power and therefore did not assume the responsibility of the occupying power. I think in retrospect that may have been a mistake. I think we should have accepted more responsibility, partly because I think we could have contributed more in that regard. But I was surprised at how underdeveloped the US plan seemed to be. There's a lot of discussion about whether that was because of disputes or lack of communication, questions of responsibility between Pentagon and the State Department. There was also the unknown as to how the war might unfold. As it turned out, the rapid collapse of the Iraqi regime brought the so-called Phase 4 part to implementation much earlier than anticipated. I met Jay Garner, who really it's only a few weeks after the war in Baghdad. He was director of the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Affairs for the United States, the occupying power. He told me his instruction was to be out of the country in 60 days. Anyway, as we know, that part of the operation bogged down for years. And as an illustration of how surreal it became, I remember on another trip to Baghdad, meeting with Bremer, who was then heading up the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was the successor to Garner's body, and being asked, and in fact briefing, senior Iraqi tribal leaders on the Australian Constitution. And the decisions to disband the Iraqi army and the Ba'ath Party were both, in my view, peremptory and unwise. It's why I think there would have been value if Australia had have played a more important place, had a more important place at the table in the post-conflict evolution. When I used to give talks on building democracies, I used to stress the importance of institutional structures. And this takes time, often a lot of time. and they can't be, and these institutions can't be imposed, not even Australia's constitutional institutions. I also wanted to say something about rules of engagement, because again, it was controversial. We, of course, made the decision that we would be part of a US-led coalition, but with Australian forces under Australian command and operating to Australian rules of engagement. And of course, the rules under which we operate would be different from some others, and in particular, different from the US, because we had accepted various humanitarian conventions that they had not. By and large, from my perspective, the US was respectful and accommodated our differences in that regard, particularly in the early years. The problems tended to develop more in the frustrations of the occupancy as the war became more of an operation against insurgency, and particularly in relation to Australians embedded in US operations, where the Australian chain of command became distant and perhaps more of a formality than a practice. I think there were some lessons learned from that part of the experience, but I would prefer not to put them on the record. A few general lessons learned from both operations from my perspective. Both conflicts have demonstrated both the effectiveness and limitations of military force. Routing Al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban on the one hand, and defeating the orthodox military of Saddam and removing him, turned out to be relatively straightforward military operations. Combating the insurgency that evolved over time, in part to the response of the presence of foreign forces, was more complicated. The application of a symmetric force made it even more difficult. And as both operations morphed into nation-building exercises, largely justified as a response to an existing terrorist or potential terrorist threat, these issues have become even more difficult. Defence forces sometimes think they have all the answers. Sometimes politicians over-rely on defence forces to solve problems for which force is not necessarily the best solution. In my view, both conflicts also illustrated how little we, the West, knew or understood of both societies, the tribal divides of Afghanistan, the sectarian divides in Iraq. Outsiders are not going to solve the intra-state cultural and religious divides of that region. I think we should have, as I said before, asserted ourselves more in the initial military phases, particularly in Iraq, post the first military phases. A superpower is a blunt instrument. It has its place, but sometimes other elements can add value. I think we also need to recognise that for much of the world, the nation-state is still an immature form. Yet global peace and security is still dependent on those states. In what is more than ever before an interdependent world, we have a vested interest in playing our part in building peaceful and stable states. The nation-building efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan might be costly and frustrating, but they remain our business. Any response to withdraw behind protective barriers, in my view, would only be paying for a greater cost further down the track. And that's not a legacy that I want to leave my grandchildren. Thank you very much.